Hey, Matt. Great to see you. Matt, take us through the thinking based on your experience that you see companies go through as they're once an issue is identified or a potential issue is identified to decide whether remediation makes sense or whether they want to exit the factory.
You know, when it comes to the indebtedness, when it comes to the excessive overtime, when it comes to the passport retention type of things, many of those things can be corrected and many of those things can be resolved. But if you start getting into sexual abuse and physical abuse and threats and various other types of activities that kind of go far and beyond what is acceptable, then the question is, what do you do in this situation? Now, the prevailing advice is you try to stay with the company and help them to fix it. And the reason for that is that if you don't do that, then these victims may be further victimized. And from a business standpoint, you know, it also could create a tremendous amount of vulnerability if all of a sudden these people are kind of thrown out on the street, they don't have any place to go, somebody finds out about it. And so there's various kind of stages of concern that organizations should have. But again, we often, as part of our advice and guidance to organizations, say, do everything you can to try to see if you can resolve this situation.
Based on our experience in working these issues together with you and others, that's certainly the line that we've heard from U.S. Customs, who has become the U.S. agency that has been most involved recently with issues of forced labor, in particular, the enforcement of those issues. We've heard the agency say many times that they prefer for companies to remediate the issues than quote, to cut and run. So that has led, I mean, I think that's certainly the prevailing mindset in the industry and kind of an expectation of the enforcer, which is good to hear because, you know, it makes sense that there's an opportunity to remediate these issues as opposed to, you know, it being the standard that you just exit immediately when you find one of these. In part because, as you say, it's the approach that is most favorable to responsible sourcing and the protection of the victims.
So imagine if you have a scenario where a supplier is audited, an audit identifies indicators of forced labor. How do you kind of come up with the anatomy for the remediation plan?
Well, ideally, what should happen is that company should already have some kind of a plan. You know, they should have looked at their risks. They should have identified people within the organization who are going to be the lead individuals. They should kind of have a set of steps that they follow so that if this happens, you almost open up the page of a manual that says the first thing is to get the committee together. We then collect the data, we analyze the data, we do site visits, et cetera, et cetera. Some companies have that, many don't. The ones that do have it sometimes feel they have something until they get into a crisis and then they realize how vulnerable they are. There's no cookie cutter approach to this. Every single situation is different. And as a result of that, you just have to kind of ensure that you are following some type of a plan to get to a point where you either protect the company, fix the situation, and then hopefully make it sustainable for the future. So if in fact they have a plan, we work with what they have. If they don't, we work with them to put something in place. But the ideal situation is for us to assemble a team, and the team would basically come together. It would include a variety of different types of actors within the organization. It could be legal and communications and C-suite or various others, and then identify what are the steps that are needed. What data is needed? Where is the data? How much data is available? Can you get access to additional data? Does that data require a field visit? If so, who's going to do it? How is that going to be done? Are there sensitivities associated with that? And then based on that, actually follow through with the data collection and then the analysis resulting in then some type of a determination afterwards in terms of what needs to be done and how does it need to be done. I think one thing that would be of benefit to a lot of legal counsel individuals is more training on this topic. And I say that not only for legal counsel, I say it for anyone who's in leadership or anyone who might be doing remediation. It's extremely important that they have the basic information to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with here.
When we're talking about the involvement of the legal department, as more of these norms are getting codified into hard law too, we've seen some of our clients a little bit more concerned about how to make sure that they're adequately protecting their communications about the issues they identified, because there might be an enforcement risk associated with it. So there's just so many layers to figuring out how to respond when you do identify issues.
Now, the segue, which is the question that we get all the time from our clients as we're working these issues, is how much is enough? How do we know whether we have properly remediated an issue? And is there, are there benchmarks that we should look to address these issues? And I asked this question, and one of the reasons why it has been so hard to measure a company's efforts against another company's efforts is because all of this is essentially a private endeavor, right? The company does not go out in the public and say how it has remediated an issue unless it's in the context of an enforcement action generally.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. What is enough? What's the point at which you feel like you've crossed over the line? Unlike kind of many of the other things that are done in business where you have enough data and enough insight into the issue that you're trying to address, in this particular realm, you have a lot of hidden aspects. You have a certain amount of perhaps deception because companies or the factories are afraid that if they share information, it's going to hurt them. And so they err on the side of not providing data. You may have policies and procedures that prevent people from getting to the location to be able to collect the information. And even if you could collect it, there's always the possibility that the manager is standing there while the person collecting the information is talking to workers. All of those things add up to, do we really know what we need to know in order to make a decision? Our advice is to do what you can, under these circumstances, that's humanly possible under those particular circumstances.
How do you guide companies in making sure that when they make these decisions that they can sort of demonstrate that they've gone through this thoughtful process that you're describing? Because we're obviously in an era now where these decisions may come under a lot more scrutiny by enforcement officials, by other stakeholders, and companies may be in a position where they really need to put their best foot forward and explain their thinking and whatnot.
It's been my experience that most companies will do anything and everything they can to resolve something like this because they understand the potential risk in terms of naming and shaming. We did an analysis 2 or 3 years ago where we looked at scandals that came up that resulted in, companies being named and shamed, and the average loss of revenue and sales and so forth was about $64 million. So you're talking about something that's quite significant that can really have an impact. And so they want to ensure that something is done in order to address this. Ultimately, just as a closing parting comment, I think that, you guys being associated with this, the brands being associated with this, the government regulators being associated with this, at the end of the day, we just want the world to be a better place. We recognize that human trafficking and modern slavery is a terrible thing. It affects people in a devastating way. And we have the ability to make changes that will result in these people being protected. And that's really what it's all about.